in the interest of time, and just so we reward those who are prompt, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Allison Eskison, and thank you so much for joining us here today to talk about multi-sectoral collaborations, particularly with multinationals, governments, and other donors. Because we have an unenviable position of being right after lunch, are going to ask that you come a little bit forward, and we're also going to ask and invite you to participate in the conversation. We've deliberately designed our panel so that it really is a conversation amongst ourselves, but we'd like you to be part of it. So please, if you have questions, just go straight up to the mic. Don't feel that you have to wait till the end of the session to interject, and we will stop ourselves, pause, have you ask questions, give your thoughts and contributions as well. So apparently the mic is working now. Again, please feel free to come forward, and we once again invite you to be part of this conversation today and to participate throughout it, not just at the very end. I just want to set the stage a little bit. I think that because you're all here, there's a general acknowledgement, realization that the challenges that we're facing are massive, and that together is the only way that we're going to be able to resolve them at a scale and a pace that is meaningful. And I know in some ways it's preaching to the converted, in that you've already come to AVPN and to this conference, and therefore you believe in the idea of collaboration. And what we wanted to tease out today is what are the different ways and perspectives in which we can partner with each other, what do we bring to that, and how and why we want to come together. And to differentiate ourselves from some of the other panels that have also focused on multi-sectoral collaboration, we are going to focus on how to engage multi-sectoral donors, bilateral donors, governments, and what that intersection might look like with some of the corporations. And we've deliberately challenged ourselves to say, let's give as many concrete examples as possible, so that there are real-time examples that you can respond to and participate in. As such, I'd like to go ahead and introduce my panelists. They are wonderful experts in their own right. We have Arnaud, who comes from INPAC. He flew in from Amsterdam, or Luxembourg, sorry, just to join us. We also have Andrea, who is from UNDP. He flew in from Beijing. We have David, who is representing the United Nations in Bangkok. And we have Ilaria, who's based here in Singapore, who represents Ben & Jerry's. And Ilaria has started with would like to launch us with a video to just introduce a little bit about Ben & Jerry's and what their position is in terms of partnerships and sustainable development.
Yo, I'm Ben.
I'm Jerry. One of the really interesting things about Ben & Jerry's is the three-part mission. That there's the economic mission, the product mission, and closest to my heart, the social mission.
Yeah, that's the key, the social mission. Most everything has an economic mission, and most everything has a product mission, but what sets Ben & Jerry's apart is the social mission. And the important thing to understand is that it's not just something that's stuck on at the end, it's something that needs to be integrated into the economic mission and the product missions of the company.
So it's not just kind of a thing on the side, it really is what Ben & Jerry's is all about. One of the important things about the three parts of the mission, Ben, is that they're all interrelated and that they're all equally important.
That's right. That's why when we print them, they're printed horizontally, not one below the other one, but one next to the other one, to indicate that they're all just as important.
Yeah, I mean, I find that the idea of having business use its power to help address social and environmental needs is something that I really believe in, and I appreciate the opportunity to be working on a brand and a product that makes it part of its essence. It's part of its raison d'etre.
Ah oui, le raison d'être.
And remember, there's a spiritual aspect to business just as there is to the lives of individuals.
As you give, you receive. As you help others, you're helped in return. As your business supports the community supports your business.
Join our core campaign and scoop for change.
Yo, I'm Ben.
I'm Jerry.
This is a great video, and it's a wonderful, it sets the stage wonderfully as we want to talk about sort of why partner and what are the unique strengths that different stakeholders bring. And I think each of us have some examples that we wanted to share. Ilaria, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. I guess, it's great to hear from the founders, really, of why Ben & Jerry's has a social mission. They were quite lucky because when they set up the business in 1978, really not many companies out there were doing it the way they set up the business for. So they really wanted Ben & Jerry's to be an agent of change. And they happened to do ice cream simply because it was the cheapest really way to start up a food business. Originally they tried to do pizzas, they wanted to do donuts, but actually to learn how to make those two products was actually much more expensive than to make ice cream. So they ended up signing up on a course which was just $5 from Penn's universities, and the rest is history. They started this small business in Burlington, in Vermont. I don't know if you've ever been to Burlington, but it's covered in snow pretty much 6 months of the year. So really, good luck to them, because the challenge was really quite big. They set up this business with the real desire to actually make a change in society whilst making money at the same time. So Ben & Jerry's is not a not-for-profit. We're definitely there to make money as well by selling ice cream, the best ice cream made in the nicest possible way. They soon realized, though, that in order to make that change, they had to really walk the walk. So they started very early on purchasing ingredients for the ice cream from like-minded suppliers. And they used their purchasing power and the supply chains to really make that change. So, for instance, the brownies that we use in our ice cream, they still come from the same partner we started working with in 1988, which is Greystone Bakery, and it's a bakery based in Yonkers, in New York. Those guys basically recruit ex-inmates who would otherwise find it quite hard to get back into work. And this bakery supplies brownies for Ben & Jerry's globally still to this day. So we're basically about 90% of their business. And over time we've had them differentiating, learning more skills and so on. That approach has really paid off for us because it's a way to make sure that your impact goes much further than what you could do just by yourself. So, for example, another great partnership that we established in 2007 was with WWF and the University of Wageningen. We wanted to launch a sustainable dairy program. Basically, dairy is the biggest ingredients for Ben & Jerry's. It's about, imagine a big pint of ice cream, about 60% is dairy. So it's our biggest ingredient. And of course, we wanted to make sure that we sourced it sustainably. So we were not sustainability experts, especially not experts in dairy as such. So we teamed up with those partners to come up with a sustainable dairy program. And we pioneered the Caring Dairy project, which is now basically has been rolled out to all the markets, so in the US and in the Netherlands, where we've got our production facilities. And the impact that we can have working through our suppliers, working through our ingredients, it's massive because we're not in there just by ourselves. We also decided that the rest of the ingredients that we were sourcing had to be sourced ethically. So we started a relationship with Fairtrade International, and I'm pleased to say just last year we actually completed the conversion of all of our key commodities, and we're talking about massive volumes of cocoa, vanilla, and bananas and so on. So really what we call linked prosperity, so these ways of working in partnerships with our suppliers to raise the bar higher and higher, it's really what's allowing us to have a strong social and environmental impact. Another example, it's the way in which we source, for example, the paper that we use for the ice cream. So that's FSC certified. The eggs that we purchase are free-range eggs. So really every single touch point that we can think of in terms of a supply chain has been taken care of. What Ben & Jerry realized, though, very early on as well, was that that's great, that's taken care of, that's our walk the walk, that's, it's living up to our own values. But we realized that we can have a much bigger impact as well if we use our voice, our influence, and our network to inspire change in those strategic issues that are important to us. So the social mission at Ben & Jerry's is divided in, we've got 3 global strategic priorities. It's social, economic, and environmental justice. So all of our campaigns around the world, they're always focused under those 3 strategic areas. And then we always look at what is relevant in the various markets we operate in, which is now 36 markets around the world, from that small gas station in Vermont. And then we work with local partners to basically do these awareness-raising campaigns. And maybe I can talk a little bit more about examples later on. But really the principle is that as a business, you can really go much further in your social mission if you work with other stakeholders, whether it's your suppliers or not-for-profit organizations that you partner with to launch awareness-raising campaigns or advocacy. It's really the way that we do it, and it's the way that we love to do it because it really increases our reach, it adds depth to what we do, and it complements really our skill set as well. So that's really, in a nutshell, why we partner.
I think that, it's incredible to think about in terms of a corporate partner. Ben & Jerry's now part of Unilever, really using its supply chain in terms of creating impact and influence, and a priori deciding that they want to do that and how they can do that in a way that works within their business model that remains quite profitable. It'll be quite interesting to hear from the other panelists about what do you think are the comparative advantages of bringing in different stakeholders, particularly some of the multinational donors or governments, and what's the value add that they have, and why would you even want to engage with them in a time when we're all very focused on both transformation as well as the transactions that lead to that ultimate transformational change.
I'll just speak a little bit. I assume everyone's heard of the United Nations, but the question I like to ask the crowd is, how many people really and truly know what the United Nations does?
Raise your hand.
Exactly. And that's why the United Nations is changing and not you. When we look at the way the United Nations traditionally has very good government contacts, very good government relationships at the national level, and that's what we do normally. What we realize, though, when you look at development, social impact, it's very local. And who is local? Private sector. Private sector, even with multinationals and corporations, they're very local. They act local, even large corporations. So this is sort of the direction that we're looking at bringing the UN in. And the UN now has allowed me to create the first and probably only social impact investment fund for the UN. And we are starting, it's a global fund, we're starting in Asia Pacific, because I'm based in Bangkok, at the regional centers in Bangkok. So I'm based there, but it really is looking at the partnerships that have been traditional partnerships and looking ahead, 10 and 20 years ahead, what is really going to impact development. So you're looking at a very strong power dynamic shift. Private sector now is taking a much larger role, initially through CSR. Some of it's more marketing than actual development, but now they're starting to take it more serious. And now with social impact investment funding, and the millennials, the new investment groups that aren't investing right now but will be in 10 years, they want to see a shift. They want to shift the way that corporations look towards development and not only a pure profit play. And this is where the UN now realizes its disadvantage with its partnerships. It's traditional partnerships at the national level, but development at the local level, and realizes that it has to reevaluate itself to look at this multilateral relationship. Change is only going to happen when every part of society gets involved. Not just policy top-down, not just at the same time community up. There's going to be a meeting in the middle, and that's where change is actually going to happen. So it really is from an upstream and a downstream, and now we're starting to position ourselves. So we have done that. We've actually looked at the multilateral, the partnership landscape, and maybe for the first time, we've actually realized that we are the ones that have to change, not the rest of the world has to change. And we are doing that. So it's a very interesting approach that we're actually taking. So we're now capitalizing the national funds. We'll start investing in social enterprises using the combination of grant, debt, equity, quasi-equity. We'll be investing for Scale, a second stage fund. It's a second stage expansion fund. So we'll be looking for startups who have a high potential to scale. And we'll be investing fairly heavy, probably around $1 million per investment. So we are looking for not only national scale, we're actually looking for regional and global scale. The UN can offer the development specialists. We have development expertise, greening supply chains, renewables. We have that development expertise. The partnership from the other side, private sector, institutional investors, VCs, have that economic and financial expertise. And we're hoping that this new platform, mixing these expertise together, and I think that's where the real true multilateral comes in, is mixing the expertise together to really sort of support social enterprises as they go towards the next stage. Just at the last point, I'll say I sort of get the feeling with all the meetings and conferences and workshops that social enterprises are being considered sort of the stepchild of the business world. And I think that's wrong. I think that the social enterprise can take advantage of every tool and opportunity that businesses have, be it franchising, licensing. There's no reason why there cannot be a social multinational. And that's sort of the area of looking at business development, bringing business development into the social space. Clearly, I've got a corporate background, but I worked for the UN for the last 8-10 years. And this is sort of the direction that we're going. So I think this is what our idea of the new multilateral relationships will be.
David, for the sake of having conversation, let me just pose a question that perhaps you can answer, perhaps Arnaud could answer. And please, by all means, in the audience, again, we invite you to participate in this conversation, so don't feel that you have to hold your conversations till the very end. But as you start to think about the creation of an impact fund and how the United Nations will pivot in terms of its engagement in market-led development, do you worry about crowding out the private sector? And how do you start to grapple with that internally? And how do you talk about that in a broader context with potential private sector?
I mean, I'll speak very briefly to that. I think the corporates and impact certainly has some add to that. But no, crowding out the private sector, the one thing that the UN does not have is a whole bunch of MBAs working for them. When you look at development cycles and how development works, they understand that. Market dynamics, the way that market dynamics work, they don't. They don't have that expertise. So we need to partner. And who has that pure example is obviously corporations. Corporations are measured at every penny on their P&L. Their investments are measured very accurately. And that's sort of the way that we want to learn. We want to learn how to measure social impact at that granularity, at that level. In the sense, we had a discussion before about monetizing social impact, but really to understand how we can do that. We're not there yet. We're learning, and that's why we're partnering, because we're partnering to learn on one side, but we're also partnering to prepare for this new world that's going to come 5, 6, 7, 10 years down the road.
And if I may add, I work for the UN in country, in China, and this learning that he just mentioned really needs to happen. Like, for me, it was a learning the last 2 days. I I'm new to this field, to the venture philanthropy field, and I do the more traditional development work at the country level. And a lot of the language that you use is new to me, and a lot of the language that I use is new to you. And we don't really understand each other, especially at the country level. And yet there are a lot of things that we can do together. So this is a learning opportunity for both. We sort of represent the old institutions, the old style of doing development, but we have to open to you in different ways. And there's many different ways that we can work together. Now, David represents the future within the UN. He's really trying to, in a way, really capitalize on what is happening. But the reality is that there's a lot of work at the country level where you, and a lot of the funding that you provide, and a lot of the people and partners you work with in country, you can do together with us. And I think two things that have been really struck me in the last 2 days is, I think Doug said it in the opening of the conference yesterday, that we're all here for the same reasons. We all want to, address the same challenges. We want to make the world a better place. And so we agree on what we want to do. I think the difference is the how. How are we doing it? And we need to work together on the how, because a lot of you bring a lot of new ways of doing the same, of addressing the same challenges. And I think this is where the UN has to learn. I'm speaking for the UN, but I would say this, we represent broader than just the United Nations, all the international institutions, even the really big international NGOs that have been around for a long time. I think we've seen really, as David was pointing to, a real change in the way that international development or supporting the social sector, call it what you may, is being implemented at the country level. And I think two ways, maybe I can mention 2 ways that I think we have to partner better together. And then I can, later on in the panel, I can give more examples of what we're doing in China. So first of all, at the global level, I feel like a lot of you, or the philanthropic sector, especially the venture philanthropic sector, is not really engaged in a lot of the development discussions and conversations that are defining what the challenges we're going to address are. So some of you may know that this year is the last year of the Millennium Development Goals. They're expiring this year, and they're expiring with quite a bit of success in a number of areas. A lot of the areas that many of you are funding or working in: education, healthcare, poverty reduction. And this year the UN will vote on a new development agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. They will vote on the new goals in September in New York. And this will be an agenda for the next 20 years that really will set the tone of what are the global challenges, what are the problems, but especially the baseline, the details of how to respond also to these problems. And this is where I think the philanthropic world needs to be engaging more in these conversations, because you bring a lot of new ways to address the same old problems. When the Millennium Development Goals were designed in 2000, it was really a conversation between governments and international organizations and some civil society at the table. But it was really, we were the only actors in this field. And in the last 15 years, it's been an incredible change. We now know that there are actors out there like the Gates Foundation or Bloomberg Philanthropies that together have a bigger budget than the entire United Nations. So, and they really shape, the narrative, the dialogue around specific issues. They have changed the global attention to specific issues. And I'll tell you later, we're working with Bloomberg, for example, in China on anti-smoking policies. And because of the partnership between Bloomberg and the UN, we've achieved great progress that had Bloomberg not come into this field, probably wouldn't have happened. So at the global level, I guess the message is we should understand each other more. And I think from your side, you need to get more engaged into these conversations and policy discussions that in a way will impact the work that you're doing at the country level. And then at the country level, I think, and we can give you more examples later, there are a lot of ways that you can use the older institutions like UNDP to achieve your goals. We, as the UN, can provide a policy platform, a safe platform for different stakeholders to come to the table. And we connect very well. We've been doing this for 20 years. We connect civil society and government. I've heard a lot of talk in the last 2 days about how do you access government. We're doing a lot of good work on the ground. We've managed to scale up a lot of our projects, and yet then we want to achieve some policy change, but we don't have that type of access. Well, the UN has, as David was mentioning, in a lot of countries the UN has access to government. And if you're smart in the way you position yourselves, and if you learn through us to talk the language of government, I think the American ambassador yesterday said it, that sometimes philanthropists don't know how to talk to government. and they don't understand how to deal with government. We do. And so there's a lot of things that we're doing on the ground in China that I can talk about it later, but definitely it's a learning process on both sides, and I've been happy to be here because I've learned a lot about many of you and what you're doing on the ground. But I think the thing that I do in China, whenever I do something in terms of development projects, I always want to look at the systemic change that I can achieve. And the only, whether you're funding after school programs or feeding programs in 10 schools, and then you're managing to do a better job, and it grows to 100 pilot programs and 200. I mean, what you really want in the end is what we want, which is the government recognizing that that issue is important and institutionalizing that issue within government policy and making it sustainable over the long run. And we are one of the ways that can happen. And we can talk a little bit more about how.
Hello, I'm Arno. I'm coming from Luxembourg, as you mentioned. So we are a consulting company. We help in the design and the structuring of impact finance funds. So we've been working the last 7 years, thank you. Mainly, I would say, with a lot of these multilateral funders in order to design efficient coordination platform for different kinds of investors. To support impact finance strategies. And I'll give you just one example that we designed already now 10 years ago. It's the 10th anniversary of one of the biggest microfinance fund in the world that is called the European Fund for Southeast Europe. It was created in 2005 with the idea that in the Balkan region, after the war in the region, there has been a lot of programs ran by donors agencies, by DFIs, development finance institutions, but also some not-for-profits around microfinance and SME. And at some point they realized that it was not really efficient to run each of these programs in parallel, and they regrouped and said we should find some synergies among the different programs. So an analysis has been done to say what do we do? What kind of institution do we need to set up to get these economies of scales and synergies? And the foundation was analyzed, the bank was analyzed, and finally a fund was chosen as the best structure to actually create a coordination platform to support microfinance in the Southeast Europe. And actually the way the fund is structured is in a flexible manner to enable different kinds of investors to join the fund with their own requirements, so that they have different terms and conditions to enter into the fund. So you have donors that are contributing to the fund alongside DFIs, like, for example, the European Investment Bank or the IFC, World Bank branch for private sector, but also private investors and pension funds. And the way the fund is structured is that each of them are providing the best that they could provide to the partnership. So first, the donors, so governments are there for them what is important is really the long-term impact and to support microfinance in the region. So they are here to kind of initiate the movement and are ready to take the first loss risks. So they represent the first loss tranche into the fund. Then come the DFIs, such as I mentioned, AIB, IFC. Their role here is not to take the first loss risk. At the end, they are a bank. So they raise money on the market, and with the money that they raise on the market, thanks to their good rating, they are able to invest into impact finance. So right after the donors, they come a second loss tranche. And thanks to discussion in the investment fund, they are able to attract private investors that wouldn't come to the fund because of the risk, the perceived risk that they see in the region and in this, at the time, rather still new investment strategy that was microfinance 10 years ago. Within 10 years, it grew from a fund that was about $100 million to more than $1 billion now for microfinance. Obviously, these are very, very big figures. But this same principle is being applied to a lot of different strategies with way smaller size in general than the $1 billion. Just to give the example that each of these stakeholders around the fund. They brought what they had as the most advantage to the development sector. The donors provide risk protection, but they also link with the different local governments, so policy dialogue. They are there to make sure that the mission is not drifted due to private investors joining the fund. Then you see that DFIs, they provide their expertise in development finance, not only pure development, but development finance. They provide the expertise to deal with the donors and to deal with the governments that the private sectors cannot do, as you just rightly explained. And then the private sector is coming with a scale. As you mentioned also, the DFIs, even the DFIs, the World Bank, they have a certain limit into what they can put into a certain sector, into a certain region, so you need the private sector. And on top of this, they really liked such kind of structure, the DFIs especially, because through these independent legal entities, the investment funds, they could be way quicker to provide the necessary funding in an efficient manner to the private sector for the development. Otherwise, it goes through the whole internal system of credit risk assessment. It takes months and years of negotiation. Here, with that kind of investment funds, from the first discussion with the investee to the actual disbursement, it could be as quick as 1 month, 1 month and a half. So here, the development finance institutions, they use actually a private investment manager to run this independent legal entity and to run independent risk decision processes. So that's really something that they are really keen to develop since this first fund that was created in 2005. Now there are 13, 14 of these structured funds that are existing. In total, they amount to $3 billion, which is still small compared to the financial sector, but just for impact finance, $3 billion is going to impact finance. It started with microfinance, then we did funds in energy efficiency, social entrepreneurship. Now we are talking about, we just launched a fund on biodiversity, investing into biodiversity, and with another entity from the UN, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, we are working now on sustainable land management. So this is another way to actually do a partnership between the pure public actors and the private. And even more than the investment fund, the funding itself, it's really the coordination role that is important. Because these partners, as you've seen, I mean, the fund has been created 10 years ago. It still is present in the region, is really considered as the partner for all microfinance institutions in the region, and is considered as a long-term partner to the sector. Because it's a coordination platform, all the stakeholders of the sector know all that there is a point of contact. If you want to do something in an efficient manner for the sector in the region, they can use this vehicle, not only for funding, but also for policy dialogue, for market assessment, for impact analysis, because alongside the investment fund, most of the time we have what we call a technical facility who's there to complement the funding through capacity building grant that is provided to the investees of the fund.
That's incredibly helpful. I think as we're sitting here talking together about what the different stakeholders bring and why multi-sectoral collaboration is important, I think each of them have brought up very different examples that range from innovative financing and how innovative financing can both layer the risk and allow for the expansion and scale to be achieved, as well as innovative financing instruments to be a platform that brings together or creates the space for collaboration and discussion about a sector. Ilaria talked a lot about supply chain and a corporation being able to use its supply chain to drive change, and change that's meaningful and, quite frankly, sustainable because it's market-led. David also gave an example of the UN and the shift in the power balance and the recognition among the multilaterals and bilaterals that times are changing, that the stakeholders and the leaders of development are not necessarily only the multilaterals and bilaterals, and that there is a greater acknowledgement that how we're going to approach each other and how we're going to converse is going to be different, leading with the fund, the Impact Investment Fund that he's doing. And then Andrea raised the importance and the value add that multilaterals still have in terms of having both convening power as well as having the existing relationships with the governments, and that can help particularly the private sector, particularly venture philanthropists, to leapfrog into the types of activities that you want to do because they can help smooth the way. I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask each of you is, so much of development can arguably be said to have been driven by the West. So as we're sitting here in Singapore, as we're at the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network event, what do you think, how do you think all of your examples will play out in Asian context? Will they be adapted? Will there be lessons learned that should evolve in an application here? And how might each of your organizations play a role in that?
I'll take that. I think, I mean, I said a little bit earlier how we tend to work at Ben & Jerry's. So we do have a global strategy, and that global strategy, it's a 5-year strategy for social mission. So we've just reviewed it last November. So our strategy is global, but it's also local. And what that means is that we've got umbrella issues that we want to target and see, moving the needle over time, but that those umbrella issues, then we look at them through a local lens. So that mirrors itself in the way we actually partner. So every time we're in a country launching an awareness campaign, for example, we always make sure that we found a partner that's locally run, because they bring the local expertise that we do not have. We make sure that the organization that we partner with is influential, and it's also receptive, because not every organization is actually keen to work with the corporate sector. And I want to pick a bone with you. Because I hear again and again that corporate sector, oh yeah, they bring in the money. But actually corporates can bring in so much more than just money. It's the way, look at what we do. We sell ice cream, but the marketing expertise can actually be transferred to so many other issues. And I'll give you an example of a campaign that we've just launched a month ago here in Singapore. And that is a tri-sector partnership. And I'm very proud of that initiative, because in Singapore, I think you don't see that many tri-sector partnerships, or at least not that many that have been successful. So when I approached these two organizations, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, there was some nervousness about launching a partnership. Because, partnerships can be risky. I always sort of say, and when I was telling that to Alison the other day, she was laughing, but I always look at partnerships a bit like, you are dating. When you're dating, there's some partners that you fall in love at first sight. Some of them have got marriage potential. Some of them are just a one-night stand. Sometimes your partners, your parents set you up, and then you're kind of like, oh yeah. You find out you're already together and things are not going very well, but you're already committed. So you got to, again, stick with that. And sometimes it does end in divorce. So it's very, very important when you look for a partner that you know exactly what you're looking for. And for us, finding those partners, as I said, they're credible, they're action-oriented, they're locally run, they're influential and receptive. It's absolutely key. Can I show another very short video, just so that then I can talk about a specific Singaporean example? Thank you, Janice.
So about 7 years ago, because of the work that we're doing at School of Thought, we began to realize that if you put a group of people together and you bring together a meaningful tension, a tension where people have stake, that they can begin to have an opportunity to have conversations about the identity, their values, and perhaps what they truly stand for. A new question began to come up for us, and the question was, could we begin to bring the powerful learning that we had in our classrooms and bring them out into the city space? What we wanted to do is bring people into the city. We get a real experience of the tone and the mood, and even the hustle and bustle of the people. So there were 3 powerful lenses that we decided to bring into the trail: head, heart, and hands. The first is to look at the head, the way that we design our city, the way that we structure it, and perhaps through that structure start to inform the way that we live in Singapore. But the second way is through the heart. How do people live their lives? What are the stories they live? And what are the experiences that they have that we could begin to listen to and gain empathy of? The third is through the hands. And the question is, what is our response? And what is the action that we need to take to make Singapore better? So what we did is we took those 3 separate things and we weaved it together into a single 2-hour experience. So what we can promise is that on these trails, you will gain insight, you will gain learning, and you will have really meaningful conversation. But most of our hope is that you will discover a new passion for our community in our Singapore. So join us on our 3 trails to Little India, Jalan Besar, and Toa Payoh. Come.
Thank you. So when I arrived in Singapore a year ago on my secondment, my briefing was we really want you to help the local teams accelerate the social mission and localize our global social mission strategy across Singapore, Japan, and Australia, which are the 3 countries where I'm working across. And as I was saying earlier on, social justice, it's one of the key focus areas of the strategy. So when I arrived, of course, I'm Italian, I've lived in the UK a long time, and in Honduras and in Germany, and I had no clue what really the local entry point for social justice could be. So I had lots of coffees, I met a lot of people, I met a lot of NGO leaders, I met a lot of people from government, I met a lot of people working with other corporates doing CSR projects, I met with intermediaries, really to try to get under the skin of Singapore and understand what the local tensions are. And basically what we found out through those interviews and those conversations is that social cohesion and social integration, it's a very, very important issue in Singapore, more than in other places, because it's so multicultural, because it's such a new country, with your 50th anniversary just coming up this August. So we decided that we really wanted to launch a campaign, at least like a pilot, of start something up for 6 months to see, to try to really promote social cohesion and social integration in the city-state across the expat community and the local community, because a lot of people in Singapore don't actually know a lot of, what areas like Toa Payoh, for example, or what kind of social tensions you have there and so on. So we thought that by launching a series of civic trails, experiential trails that bring people on these journeys, small groups, 10, 12 people, can really develop empathy, and people can learn about those issues and across culture. We, of course, couldn't do it by ourselves because, again, we are experts at making ice cream. We're not experts in social change. So we looked at the partner landscape of the people that were doing similar work to what we wanted to do, that we could partner with. And the Thought Collective was basically a match made in heaven. It's a social enterprise. Tong Ye, the founder, the co-founder you saw in the video, was extremely open and receptive at working with us on that. So we decided that we were going to curate a series of 3 trails and use that as in a way to really talk about the issue of social integration. But we wanted to go even further and do it in a way that we would also bring government agencies with us on this journey. Because again, as we were saying early on, it increases the reach that you can have. You've got different networks you can tap into. Even financially partnering, it's great because you can sort of like join your resources. We approached the National Population and Talent Division, and they've got the National Integration Council on board. And we basically launched this series of 3 trails. And I'm really proud to say that so far we've had only 16 trails and they've all been run at full capacity. So that partnership, you know, what worked well there so far, you know, of course, you know, we're very new into it, but it's the fact that there was no ego at all. You know, we all were in that partnership to make things work. We, knowing that, for example, for MPTD, this was the first initiative of that kind, we made sure that we had a lot of time for planning, a lot of time for internal approvals, a lot of time really for devising the strategy and dividing kind of like, you know, which areas we wanted to conquer. And also different assets. For instance, Ben & Jerry's, you know, we're an American company, we're a big corporate, we're part of Unilever. So we have been able to leverage that kind of like network and the contacts with a lot of other corporate companies to make sure that there are plenty of expats coming on these trails to learn about the social issues that Singapore is facing. Of course, the Thought Collective, it's a social enterprise, so they've got very good networks within the NGO sector. And the National Integration Councils were able to tap into all of the network with the Indian community, the Chinese clans, and so on. So we're really, between the 3 of us, being able to do something that we would have never been able to do by ourselves. And that's why, you know, I think that it goes well beyond the economic value, right? It's really about the marketing skills, it's about the networks and a lot of other things that corporate can bring to any type of partnership.
Maybe to follow up on that, as the other Italian on the panel who has lived in different places around the world and didn't understand the challenges of the country where I moved to, which I've been in China now for more than 2 years working for the United Nations there. So to follow up on your point of how it's true, it's not just about money. Actually, it's really rarely it's about money, for me at least. So 2 of the things I'm proudest of that I've been able to achieve since I've been in China, I have done together with other partners, as I was talking before, using this platform that the UN can be, to bring different sectors together at the table and try to kind of address one issue. And we received funding in both cases from the corporate sector or from a foundation. And in both cases, they were very small grants, you know, of less than $100,000 each. And we managed to do 2 things. One of them was, as it relates to you and to a lot of the people who are interested in China as the next, big frontier for philanthropy. So UNDP has had long-standing contacts within the government in China, especially with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which is the ministry that works on NGO and CSO registration and how NGOs and the social sector can operate in China. And a couple of years ago, we got a small grant from, 2 small grants from 2 different foundations to bring different NGOs together, especially small community-based organizations, to kind of do an assessment of what were the challenges they were facing on the ground, what needed to change from a governance perspective in order to make their lives easier. And we brought different people around the table, and we managed, in a very complicated, slow process, over 2 years, we managed to actually achieve a reform that the Ministry of Civil Affairs just passed 18 months ago. That was a real improvement from what was there before. So now a number of specific NGOs, service delivery organizations, and foundations can now register officially in China. We're now all waiting to see what happens with the next charity law. And because of what we happen to achieve on the NGO registration front, we're now looking to do the same thing on the philanthropy front. So I'm working with a number of innovative venture philanthropy types in China, especially a couple of very young organizations that are looking at the crowdfunding area in China and how that can play a role to basically innovate the philanthropic sector. And we're doing the same thing. We're looking to do an assessment. We're writing a report together with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, and we hope to do a consultation later this year with a number of philanthropists and ourselves and the Ministry of Civil Affairs with the same people who are drafting the new charity law in China. So hopefully influencing what will be in the charity law, which is this law that everybody has been waiting for 10 years, that will hopefully regulate the sector and hopefully enable the sector to really unleash its potential in China. That's one example. And the second example, I was mentioning before on smoking. We got a very small grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies. As you know, some of you may know, Bloomberg is very much engaged in the issue of smoking globally, and especially in China, India, in the developing world, in China and India being their priority countries. And you know, this is a field that was already crowded. There have been so many people working on anti-smoking policies and advocacy and for many years, and they were talking mostly to the Ministry of Health. And they were doing a good job, but they were basically talking just to the converted among themselves about what needed to be done. And we all know that the Ministry of Health in any country is probably the weakest ministry around the table. When a cabinet meeting happens, it is not going to be the Minister of Health who decides what gets passed. So what we did was we partnered with a number of organizations who were working in the field, who knew the field very well, with Bloomberg and the UN. We brought in also WHO, the World Health Organization, and together we set up this coordination mechanism that meets every 6 months and really coordinates everything that is happening in that field in China. And because we did that, we realized what the gaps were. We realized that there was no research being done on the actual economic costs of smoking. And there was no data, no convincing data that could convince the government that something needed to be done beyond healthcare costs, beyond the conversation that was going on with the Ministry of Health. So what we did is we brought the Ministry of Finance to the table. We brought the Ministry of Commerce and Trade to the table, which is the ministry that actually manages the tobacco monopoly and policies. And this is a year and a half ago now, we basically commissioned a number of studies that speak more to those ministries. We came out with a lot of data that shows that although the government is making a lot of money out of people smoking, because they, of course, because of taxes on tobacco packages, we show the Ministry of Finance how much money they're losing, and they will lose increasingly over the next 30 years if they don't do anything on this. And guess what? 6 months later, the State Council, which is China's cabinet, passed the first draft of a national anti-smoking law. And we're now working with the State Council to finalize, and hopefully, the first draft is very good, and usually in China what happens, the first draft is always amazing, and then the second draft drops considerably. So we're hoping that the second draft remains as good as the first, but it's been a huge progress. And all this we've done with $80,000. And if the law passes, we will impact 1.4 billion people because of a small project that got together everybody at the table and identified what the gaps were, and we would create systemic change. So those are two small examples of how philanthropists have engaged with us and have used our platform at the country level in a good way.
I think both perspectives are very correct, and they're both very correct in their propositions. I think what's in the Asia-Pacific region, what's going to happen, if you look at the way that philanthropy was developed in the post-industrial revolution of the West, and the wealthy families at that time, and the role that they had, is going to be very different than the European experience in the post-war environment where the wealthy families come up and where they had. Now in Asia, still a very, very fragmented market, not consolidated market yet, a lot of gaps in the market, and I think this is the opportunity for the people in the audience, the funders, and AVPN, for example, to really have an influence on how this is going to be defined. What is philanthropy going to be like in Asia Pacific in the post-information society as we move into that? We're moving away from the digital society into a new Internet of Things environment, the new financial markets that are coming up, the new political dynamics that are coming up, and I think there's an opportunity, I think a huge opportunity, for the funders to get engaged in that process and to define, where I don't think that was very much involved in the Western experience or the European experience. The Asian experience now, which is just starting, there's a lot of upside. And that could be upside influence policy, downside influence, community level experience, and also that creation of that new economic class, whether it's SME, sub-SME, micro-SME class, that's going to really be the driver behind future economies. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. Now the platforms to do that, as you can see, this is where the multilateral comes in. From the UN perspective, the multilaterals, from the policy perspective, we can engage on that side. We understand the language and the way that these environments work. Certainly corporations understand the local side and that multinational side, certainly the financial and the math side. They can also be a partner in this. But I think the real onus is really on you. What is your role and how do you get involved in that? And what is the position of APPN and other platforms like that to really get your voices together as, I don't want to say a lobbying group, because I think lobbying is very 1920s. There's a very new way of looking at the way to influence policies. And I think that's the real big question. I don't think it's defined yet. I think there's a big question on the role of the funders as well as the future on the corporations and the global multilaterals and what their role is.
Coming back to maybe more down into the examples compared to this high-level agenda for the funders, I mean, there are other examples where you see venture philanthropists, not-for-profits, and foundations teaming up with the private investment sector. Just for example, Oxfam, the well-known not-for-profit, the Oxfam UK teamed up with an investment advisor called Symbiotics. Symbiotics is a microfinance investment specialist, and together they created a fund to actually promote small enterprise impact investing fund. Symbiotics bringing their credit risk assessment methodology, their ability to talk to investors, to do fundraising, to operate the engine of an investment fund, and to deal with the investees, and Oxfam bringing the development goals, their eligibility criteria, how to assess the actual impact when you invest, because we all talk about impact finance funds, but still we're still just at the level of providing some indicators about the impact, how many investees, how many women, how much goes into rural areas, etc. And this is where I think, well, some of these investment advisors, they do have a lot to learn from the not-for-profit, from the people on the ground, to say, well, it's again not only about an investment and financial return, but an impact. And I think these kind of combination is really helpful. Another example is Shell Foundation. Shell Foundation, well, there was another panel with Richard from Shell Foundation before, but Shell Foundation is really supportive to a lot of innovative ways to promote well, impact projects in general. And they teamed up already years ago with SME finance provider in Africa called Grofin. So Grofin is established in 8 countries throughout Africa, and they provide debt of size between, let's say, $200,000 to $500,000 to SMEs throughout their offices. And it's not only just providing debt, like a bank could do, even though banks are not doing, and that's why they are existing, but they also provide what they call business support, kind of capacity building support. So alongside their investment, they provide the support for the SMEs to be ready to be invested and to develop their business. And that was really interesting to Shell Foundation. So Shell Foundation is one of the early supporters of these, let's say, private commercial investment advisor, and together they developed a whole methodology to reach more and more SMEs throughout Africa, which is SME finance is still really, really difficult. And now they've just launched, in relation to the example that I explained just before, a new fund that is based on the same idea with layered structure, where they seek some donor funding, then DFI money, and they will leverage private investors. So I think there are a lot of these examples, so not only with DFIs, but with practitioners, where I think on the investment side, the investment specialists could learn a lot from the different practitioners, foundations, not-for-profit, etc. But I think one of the most important role that could venture philanthropists play is also on, again, building what we call the ecosystem of the impact finance world. Because funding is not, there is sufficient funding. There are billions of investment that are waiting to get disbursed into impact finance. Just recently, for one of the microfinance funds that we advise, we've been able to raise $150 million from two investment banks in Germany, because the structure was sufficiently in line with their requirements in terms of liquidity, in terms of size, etc. Obviously, these are really big figures, but this just shows that whenever you have the structure right, they would come. Then the next question is about the pipeline. Do we have currently the pipeline and investment-ready enterprises? I think that's what we hear from investors, that for the moment we are lacking investable opportunities. Not because they are not existing, but mainly, I think, because we are lacking professional intermediaries that are there on the field in the countries to identify the opportunities, to grow them, to make them investment ready, and to put them on the radar screen of all these investors. So we hear a lot about impact finance, but still it doesn't pick up. So I think for venture philanthropists, foundations, etc., it's a key role that they could play to support the creation of more and more of these small investment advisors who will not become directly the managers of the billion-dollar fund. That's not the goal. But they gradually will build their expertise in education finance into a specific country, in health, in whatever, but providing the specific expertise to really build the future of this pipeline and really put the missing block into the whole chain of investment. I think that's one of the major roles that they could play, on top of the usual grant money that they could provide for capacity building, and then an investment of their endowment in top of the senior tranches. But also what we are pushing more and more, and Shell Foundation has been one of the first foundations to do that, is to take the risk together with the governments and take the first loss risk in order to really play the role of the leverage factor to attract these private investors. That's another role that I see really important from the foundations.
This is incredibly interesting. The organization I work for is called Shujog, and we are an ecosystem player here in Asia. And one of the things that we found is that you're right, that there's not enough intermediaries to provide some of the support to make the organizations investable. And so we have a technical assistance program that focuses on investment readiness services and really just provides the liquidity for organizations to be able to access those professional services so that they do become attractive to impact investors. But one of the things that I heard, and I just wanted to touch upon, is do we think that it's the role of donors and multilaterals and bilaterals to create that ecosystem? Do we think that there's a role for corporations to play in terms of how they provide purchase orders, and those purchase orders can then be used as secured for collateral in terms of secured lending? Is it really just a donor issue, and is it a multilateral donor issue, or are we really saying venture philanthropists, when you're thinking about systemic change, your comparative advantage is playing at this small level, because if you seed that it will automatically get scaled, that the coordination and the pieces of the value chain to get to the innovative financing are in place, that really this is the only piece that's missing.
No, I think the perspective that we would look at from a funding perspective and also from the donor perspective is you're looking for these multipliers. You would never invest or even grant, I don't think, in something that's a one-off. So you're looking for scale at the design level. And there's a big difference between content and process. So the thematic areas you want to invest in and that process of putting money towards it. I think the processes, there's a lot to learn. Corporations have those processes. They understand the processes. Content, I think also the multilaterals bring a lot of expertise from the development side into this. But again, when you look at the multipliers, that's the math game. And I think that's where the investors come in and that's where the donors come in, is you're always looking for these multipliers, these catalytic points of investment that are going to create multi-income streams that's going to be much more than simply growing the market for your product or service. It's growing into new businesses. It's the innovation side, the R&D side. And I think that's also where donors come in. The donors should be demanding enough to be looking for that R&D side of their investment to make sure that there isn't only growth, but there's multiple ways of growing.
Maybe from my perspective, I think I totally agree. I'm going to pick on you a second, since she did too. No, I totally agree on all this, and I think we clearly also sometimes, as I was saying at the beginning, we speak different languages. To me, it's true. It is about. I think to answer your question, it's everybody's responsibility, and it's what I would call investing in civil society, in broader civil society, which I see in a place like China, very few people do. But sometimes it's also about looking at the long term and not immediately at the multipliers or immediately looking at something that can definitely grow. Sometimes you also have to take a lot of risk, and sometimes you might have to invest in something that might not give you any return right now, but might be good in terms of really strengthening the overall environment, as you were saying. And I think one of the problems we find at the UN, it's good to hear him. We clearly work in different environments. It's good to hear somebody say, "Oh, funding is not a problem. There's plenty of billions of dollars out there. We have enough money. We just don't know how to spend them." Working at the country level, I can tell you. I mean, we are really struggling. We don't see that money coming through, and we don't see. I mean, I see plenty of amazing organizations who I know would achieve incredible change. And they're going 3 months after 3 months, applying for a grant, for another grant, and then they have to report on that grant, and then they're struggling, they have to close an office and move somewhere else. And so that one of the things that I love about this conference is that I heard a lot about saying, let's change the way we work, let's give sustainable funding, let's give longer term funding, let's allow the actors and the players who are really good at doing what they do, let's let them be who they are. Let's give them the space to be who they are and to deliver. But often these people don't deliver in 6 months. Often these people will deliver in 3 or 4 years. And so we also need people, we need you to be much more risk, to approach risk in a different way and say, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. And maybe I can go back to your other question of like the idea of like Western philanthropy and Asia. And seen from China, I think also it touches on both points, because I remember when Bill Gates came to China a year and a half ago and came to promote the Giving Pledge. So came to promote the idea that every single billionaire needs to give away 50% of his money or her money and do it in a specific way. And everybody was so excited about it. It was like, wow, this is the leader of international philanthropy, or one type of philanthropy, coming to the next new market. And there was a huge backlash, because the Chinese were like, no thanks, we are going to do it our way. We're going to give our money away our way, and we don't need you to tell us how to do it. We are a different society, we have different morals, different values, and we've been doing it for a long time, and we're going to structure our structures in a different way. We're going to design our foundations in a different way, thanks. And I don't think anybody was prepared for that. And so one way of avoiding that we do at the UN a lot, and we've been doing for a long time, and I think more of you needs to think about, is how do you connect different countries? We call it South-South cooperation. So, and I think that's where Singapore actually, and AVPN, as he was saying, can play a great role in structures like AVPN. How do you show a country like China that it needs to go in a certain direction, not necessarily because America says so, and in China, of course, there are political components there, but because other countries in Asia Pacific are doing it, and it's worked in these countries. And one thing the UN does is we do work a lot on very sensitive issues that a country might not want to do and not want to take on. And often we do it in this mechanism. We show a country that Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia have done this. And this is what's, we bring different countries together to discuss a certain issue. And I don't see this in the philanthropic world yet. And I think it's something that needs to be explored more. So.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of really interesting points here. You ask about can the corporate have a bigger role, play a bigger role in building ecosystems? And I think certainly yes. I don't think that it's only down to the multilateral organization or intermediaries or philanthropists to build that ecosystem. I'll give an example. Ben & Jerry's, we launched a competition with Ashoka in 2012, and it was basically a hunt for social entrepreneurs. So we really wanted to bring home the fact that Ben & Jerry's are a different type of business, that our heritage, that our founders were social entrepreneurs back in the days when the word social entrepreneurship didn't even exist. So we wanted really to make sure that the message came across in new markets and in older markets. But we had really, so we launched this competition to look for social entrepreneurs. And we rolled out a competition pretty much with a similar model in a lot of different countries, from 5 European countries to 9 European countries. And last year we launched a competition in Singapore and in Japan for the first time. And what we realized very quickly is that Singapore, it's a different kettle of fish. Because social entrepreneurship is so new, because the market is so small, we couldn't really apply the same principles that we were applying in the rest of the world. So we had to make some changes to the entry criteria. So we had to have slightly older age group, because here entrepreneurs tend to be slightly older than in Europe, for example. And in fact, this year we're actually looking at changing that concept of Singapore altogether, because we realized that the ecosystem for social entrepreneurship is still very, very small and very niche here. So we decided that we were going to change the format of the competition, looking for people that were basically at much earlier stages, not existing social enterprises, but business plan competitions, which was a very different idea that we had when we started up in 2012. But we decided to really build that flexibility in our thinking because of the local need and because the ecosystem was different than what we expected it to be. So our role has really changed, because it's not going to be our own branded competition. It's not going to be join our core as such. It's going to be tapping into something that locally is already run by a university, and it's been run very successfully over the last 3-4 years. And we can bring in again our marketing, our finances, our PR ability to make that existing competition bigger, and to then increase the pool of hopefully social enterprises that will come out of it in the next 3 to 5 years. So that intervention at an earlier stage, it's very important. One word of caution though, tapping on what you were saying, I think that philanthropists are in a very lucky position, because you don't have shareholders to respond to. So the flexibility that you have to fund specific areas, risking investments, or areas that are not sexy or not, you've got a real power that a corporate doesn't necessarily always have. So I think that there are different roles to play there.
Arnaud, I'm going to let you have a chance to speak, but I also want to make certain that if anybody has questions, please feel free to join, step up to the microphone. We are happy to take them at any time. I guess one of the things that when I think about, why consider multi-sector, multi-stakeholder collaboration, why think about a multilateral corporation, donor or a corporation, it's the idea of scale, that you go from being a philanthropist and running a project or a program to seeing that it's successful and wanting to see somebody take it on and roll it out in a much larger scale. would any of you like to speak to, what does it take for a multilateral organization to want to scale something and to expand it?
I can touch it a bit, but I also want to add to this comment here that we did a program. I was brought into the Maldives government. The Maldives government, they have a very large youth unemployment problem. They have a very large youth unemployment problem. And they wanted to set up sort of a social welfare grant for training and job creation, something like this. And so I went in, and so we started to discuss this, how we would design that. And obviously, when you're giving grants for job creation, when the grants run out, the job creation runs out. And there's no multiplier. So we started looking at creating this startup, this entrepreneur initiative. And where the government, we designed it in a way the government was very happy with it and gave us $10 million to put this together. But the social component wasn't there. There was no entrepreneurial skill, really, culture in the Maldives. So to start with a social entrepreneur skill was very difficult. So we actually had to start with a youth entrepreneur program and start that youth entrepreneur program where we did get a lot of funding from the wealthy families in Maldives, also in Malaysia. So we did get philanthropy in, but it wasn't done in a way of venture philanthropy in that sense. And now we are starting to set up the ecosystem and the training involved on the social innovation side of that. What are the social? But even in this first challenge that we put together, we did have extra in the scoring card for the assessment when we were doing the selection. We did actually have extra points in for social, but it was 80% based on pure business startups. And then we brought in the social, women empowerment, and a couple of the other angles where they got extra points from the selection side. So it's really interesting that there is sort of a dynamic where entrepreneurship comes before social entrepreneurship, I think. Innovation becomes before social innovation. And that's something to remember when, from the philanthropy side, that you may have to kickstart it before you actually get into the real social impact that comes off later.
Thank you. Just to come back to this, to come back to the whether should we wait for the Western to come here to Asia and replicate what they've done. I think especially microfinance at the beginning was really started by these multilateral investors taking the risk and then paving the way for then private sector to invest into that, because there was nobody else to deal with that at the moment. Even foundations were not at the time thinking about investment. And that was their role. That is still their role. Building the ecosystem, as I said, taking the first loss risk, taking the risk to invest into something that is not well tested, and building the different professionals that could do that on the long run, and proving that the strategy is, and demonstrating that the strategy is workable and makes sense. Now in Asia, there is, well, that's why you have AVPN, there is sufficient actors that could take this role to actually test the strategy, to build these professional experts, etc., and not waiting for the multilateral funders to do that. Especially because we're talking about sectors that would not require the same kind of volumes that initially microfinance or energy project, renewable energy projects are dealing with. We are dealing in millions, whereas when we talk about social enterprises, it's definitely directly smaller. So that's difficult for a DFI to engage directly into such kind of instruments directly. But they are interested and they're ready to put their money if the product is right, if the strategy is there, if the pipeline is there, if it is run by professionals. So I would say venture philanthropists are there to do the first tests, put their money into a $5 million fund, show that the strategy works, that there is a pipeline, put the transparency on the investment, and then the third or fourth or fifth fund of the same kind of strategy would lead to the minimum size. And then the DFIs will come to bring the scale, put their money at a second loss, and then you will see the pension funds that are coming. But I think, especially for, as we said, social enterprises, there is more a role for the venture philanthropists than directly the multilateral.
I think there's a question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the engaging discussion. I'm Samira from Charities Aid Foundation. I'll start with a stat. The OECD has estimated that globally middle classes are expected to grow by about 165% by 2030. Now, some nifty number crunching has sort of estimated that if this global middle class gave on average 0.4% of their spending, which is the average in the UK, it would generate about $224 billion a year. I'd like to get your thoughts on how we could engage this segment of donors to address some of the finance gaps, or to invest in getting those organizations investment ready, or to invest in unsexy causes that could have a more, I guess, a greater impact, and it would also be engaging domestic giving and building civil society.
I think that's it's an institutional or an ecosystem sort of question. Once we can get social investment down to a retail investor level, that's where you're going to get a lot of participation by those who are buying and selling shares. So, and Asia IX is doing a great job in sort of developing the social stock exchange industry. As far as getting them down, so the retail investors understand what they're investing in on the social impact. Right now it's at a very much an institutional layer. Governments, venture philanthropists, families, corporations, these types, hedge funds, SRI hedge funds. But I think that's the big challenge of how do we bring that down now to a retail level where we can actually tap into those types of funds. And maybe you have the answer.
Now, the issue is, for the moment, from a technical perspective, regulators in each domicile of all these funds, they want to protect the investors, and especially the retail investors. So they say these are illiquid markets, so you cannot get in and get out the way you want into this fund. They are risky. It could be volatile. Even if you look at microfinance, it has been a steady return over the last 10 years. So for the moment, that's the biggest issue we have in structuring funds, is to get these retail investors on board, because they are protected from the regulators that prevent the funds to get money from them. However, there is a strong lobby in Europe, in the US as well, to be able to unlock this retail money. In the UK, there are some initiatives where there are some saving programs that are used to get invested then into social enterprises. I think maybe the funds are not, for the moment, the right vehicles. But for example, in Germany, they have a possibility to issue kind of certificates on investment funds. So they kind of do a securitization. They transform the shares of the fund into securities that are then traded on a market, on a secondary market, and then you can open it to retail investors. But then maybe it's not through a fund, but it's more, I don't know, a crowdfunding kind of thing. We've seen, and for example, I know that there is a crowdfunding platform that's been launched 2 or 3 years ago in France to enable peer-to-peer lending, but not like Kiva. Kiva is, you grant the money to Kiva and then you can lend through MFIs. There it's really getting a return from your investment, and then they circumvented the regulation through a quite technical way. But as David said just before, for the moment it's still really institutional investors. But that's the future, I agree.
Just to add a point to that, what's filling the gap right now is exactly that, crowdfunding. So Kickstarter, these types of platforms are actually allowing the retail investor, but they're unregulated. They're not really, for quantitative measuring, they're not exactly there. So I would expect, as a prediction, that crowdfunding is going to become institutionalized somehow. And that will allow the retailers to go in until the stock exchanges can sort of fill that gap.
And I'm getting the note that we're getting close to the end. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to give us your key takeaway message. What do you think the next step for venture philanthropists is? What would you encourage or like to see happen?
Well, I'll end where I started, which is I think I came here thinking that I was going to say we have to work more together across sectors, and I go home even more convinced of that. And I think that I think what I'd like you to do, I know what I'd like us in the UN to do, and as David was saying, there's a lot of changing that needs to happen within the UN system, and the OECD was just mentioned, and the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have a lot of changing to do. The fact that China is setting up its own institutions says it all. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen in our field. But what I'd like you to do is to really engage with us, to be more curious about what is happening at the international level. I said this year is a very, very important year, not only because the SDGs are being, the new development agenda is being agreed upon in New York, but then later on in December in Paris, there will be the new climate change treaty finally voted upon. So it's a year where two of the biggest development agendas will be defined. And I think there's a lot of space for a lot of you to fund specific advocacy, to support specific groups who are trying to push for really positive things to get into these international agreements. There's still a lot of space in the next 6 to 7 months to make a lot of positive change in those discussions. And then finally, at the country level, wherever you work, if you are focusing on specific countries or if you're funding specific issues in a specific country, do reach out to the international institutions and do try to think about how to use us, basically. I'm telling you, use us to achieve your goal. I guess that's my takeaway.
I think in general, when we're talking about your role as you go forward, I would honestly say don't wait for opportunities. Engage and create your own opportunities. You have an opportunity, much more than what happened in Europe and in North America, to design and to create what venture philanthropy will be in the future, because it is such a different perspective. We're in such a different world, and the rate of change that's happening right now, it's going to be very different in the next 10 years, 15 years. So I would say don't sit back and sort of wait for opportunities. Go out and help design what that's going to be and create your own opportunities. There's much more upside for you because you'll be at the forefront of that. And then give me some money so I can help you invest in that so I can make some money. But I think that's the big key message here, is that you have an opportunity to engage at a much deeper level than Europe or the West ever had in deciding what your future opportunities are going to be.
I have to say, I echo really what David is saying. So you've got the opportunity, you've got a flexibility that the corporate sector doesn't necessarily have. So really use that flexibility to build those ecosystems and make sure really that when the opportunities are there for the corporate sector, they're kind of like joining at the point where you've taken some of the risk away from them, because you will see many more corporate companies actually engaging in that stage.
I don't think I have anything to add. You've said, the keywords for me, as you mentioned, so taking the risk, protecting potentially other investors, showing that some strategies are working, trying with something that is a bit more risky, innovative at the beginning, but thinking really long term. And I have had quite a bit of discussion with some foundations who say, well, we cannot invest. Either we invest really our endowment, but it needs to be in relatively low risk investment because it's in our endowment, or then we use the return of our endowment and then we grant the money. Let's try to combine the two approaches, and do invest into something that is more risky, but that on the longer term would have a greater impact than just your grant that you provide on an annual basis. And through that, as I mentioned before, don't wait for the multilaterals, as mentioned by David, create a strategy, and then you will go and see the multilaterals thereafter. Because even if they are very big, they have so many projects that are really, really happy whenever there is a Cook project that is coming, If obviously it is well cooked, and I don't say they are really easy to cook, they're really sometimes a nightmare to work with, but still they can bring the skill that you would like to achieve through your own development goals.
Thank you so much. I think the takeaway that I hear from all of our panelists and from the question that was asked is really that this is an opportunity for each and every one of us in this auditorium, one, to be opportunistic, to help lead the change in Asia, and to create new ways about which we are going to address global problems and regional problems as well. Again, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. I think that they did an excellent job. Please join me